Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for the call. Madam Speaker, let's call this bill for what it is. This bill is the latest in a long line of coalition stunts in an attempt to denigrate the record of the previous Labor government. And let me be very clear with the House, Madam Speaker. The Labor Party is very proud of the performance of Australia during the global financial crisis, and we are not going to allow for one moment this government to rewrite Australian history. We have seen a rather pathetic attempt by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, even in recent weeks, to rewrite history, and to rewrite history not only in Australia, but shamefully for the Prime Minister, to denigrate Australia's economic record in international fora. Now, Australia's economic record over the last 23 years is one that Australia should be proud of and celebrate. The fact that we have a record of economic growth unprecedented in our history and unparalleled around the world is something that, if this government had a little bit of grace, they would acknowledge and would recognise the efforts of the previous government. But no, this Prime Minister and this Treasurer are far too small to allow that to happen. Now, we know this bill is a stunt because you can tell by the explanatory memorandum. Madam Speaker, when the Treasurer brought this bill in, I thought, well, maybe they're going to save millions of dollars by doing this. Maybe if this is such a big issue, it's a big contribution to their national savings task. And so I turned to the explanatory memorandum of the bill, circulated on the authority of the Honourable Joseph Benedict Hockey, Treasurer of Australia, and we see what the savings are generated by this bill. We're told that, the waste is so profligate, they need to control expenditure. This is an important piece of legislation, very vital to their efforts to return the budget to surplus. And we find that this measure is expected to save $0.25 million on underlying cash basis over the forward estimates, Madam Speaker. $250,000 over 4 years. That's the big effort of this government. Big bill. This big savings task. $250,000 over 4 years. This is how pathetic and how low this government has got, that we are told this bill is so important. We saw, Madam Speaker, yesterday the Leader of the House stop an MPI, stop a matter of public importance about the loss of jobs in the Northern Territory to bring on the government's legislative program, and they didn't have any legislation. They have no plan, no agenda, no legislation, and the legislation that finally comes on today makes this massive contribution to returning Australia the surplus of $250,000 over the next 4 years. Compare that to the $20 million we're spending on vouchers for marriage counselling, or the $5.5 billion we're spending on the extravagant and unaffordable paid parental leave scheme, and we find this savings task being contributed to by this bill, which saves $250,000 over 4 years. Now, I mentioned before that we've seen the Prime Minister and the Treasurer attempt to rewrite history. And we saw it in Davos in the Prime Minister's embarrassing and pathetic contribution to the Davos Forum. And he said that in the decade prior to the crisis, consistent surpluses and a preference for business helped my country, Australia, become one of the world's best-performing economies. Then a subsequent government decided that the crisis had changed the rules and we should spend our way to prosperity. Well, yes, there was a crisis, Madam Speaker, and it did require a change of government policy. And thank goodness the Labor government implemented the change of policy, because we also saw the Prime Minister in that speech, as he opened the remarks, refer to the fact that the rest of the world was still struggling to recover from the global financial crisis. But again, he did not have the good grace to recognise that Australia's performance was superior to the world performance, and that we are not dealing with the massive unemployment overhang that the rest of the world is still dealing with. And this is a key point. This is not an esoteric historical argument, Madam Speaker, about what would have happened back in 2008-9. This is an argument about what would still be happening now if the Labor government did not take the strong and decisive action that it did. Then Australia would be dealing with the sorts of economic overhang that we are seeing the rest of the world struggle with today. Today. It is not just about 2008 and 2009. It is about the fact that the rest of the world is still dealing with massive unemployment, and that Australia got through the global financial crisis, yes, with an increase in unemployment, but with an increase in unemployment nowhere near as big as the rest of the world. You know, since the election, we've lost 54,000 full-time jobs in Australia, which is more than Australia lost in the entire calendar year of 2009 during the global financial crisis under the stewardship of the previous Labor government. So we managed to save Australian jobs in the most difficult global circumstances since the 1930s, and on this government's watch already we've seen more jobs lost in less than 6 months than we saw in the entire calendar year of 2009 during the global financial crisis. But there's a problem for the Prime Minister. It didn't seem to occur to him that at Davos he was talking to exactly the people who have hailed the Labor government's achievements in the past. It didn't occur to him that he was talking to the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions which have said that Australia's efforts, and the efforts very particularly of the previous Labor government, were amongst the world's most effective in dealing with the global financial crisis. Because in the international arena they know, they saw the terrible consequences of the global financial crisis, the human consequences, the unemployment consequences around the world, which, by and large, Australia avoided. Australia avoided for a number of reasons, but most particularly the strong and decisive action of the previous Labor government. Now, an important part of the stimulus was the direct payments to families, the infrastructure investments as well, which this government seems intent on denigrating as well, but also the direct payments to families, because it was important to stimulate the economy quickly. And the facts speak for themselves. Australia was one of only 3 advanced economies out of 34 to avoid recession during the global financial crisis. One of 3 advanced economies out of 34. Will you hear the Prime Minister and the Treasurer celebrating that fact? No. They hate that fact. They hate the fact that the previous Labor government were competent economic managers who avoided recession. We hear a lot from this government about small business. Well, small business pays the price of recession. Small business goes out the back door when a recession bites, and this previous government intervened to help small business. I represent Western Sydney, as does my honourable friend, the member for Blaxland. We've seen the impacts of global downturns on Australia's vulnerable areas. And it's not just Western Sydney, it's rural and regional areas as well, which get devastated when a downturn occurs, which we intervened to assist. And at the same time, as we did this, at the same time as we avoided recession, one of only 3 out of 34 advanced economies around the world to do so, we maintained Australia's AAA credit rating, but more, for the first time in Australia's history, the 3 major ratings agencies accorded Australia a AAA credit rating. Not something that Peter Costello could achieve in all his years as Treasurer. Not once could he achieve that. Was achieved during the time of the honourable member for Lilley as Treasurer, something that this government refuses to acknowledge. And we joined the club as it became more exclusive. When we came to office, there were many more countries around the world with 3 AAA credit ratings, and we weren't one of them. And as the global financial crisis spread around the world, countries lost their credit ratings, and the club shrank. But Australia joined it as the club became more exclusive. And during this time, our period of government, Australia's GDP per capita, which is the real measure of prosperity, rose from a ranking of 17th to 8th in the world. And we jumped 3 places to go from being the 15th biggest economy in the world to the 12th when we handed over office. And during the Howard government, which we hear lauded by those opposite their economic management, did Australia jump 3 places in the world economic rankings? No, they went backwards. They went backwards in the world economic ratings during the Howard years as the mining boom enveloped Australia and they were managing growth. We had to deal with the most difficult economic circumstances since the 1930s, and we jumped 3 places in the world economic rankings. And it's not just about rankings. This makes a difference. This means that our income was higher. We were a richer country compared to the rest of the world, something we are proud of and something this government is too small-minded to acknowledge, too mean-spirited and small-minded to acknowledge for even a second. And let's look at what other people have said about the former Labor government's contribution during the global financial crisis. We saw Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who stated, "You were lucky, probably, to have the best designed stimulus package out of any of the countries, advanced industrial countries, both in size and design, timing and how it was spent, and I think it served Australia well." And the honourable member opposite denigrates Professor Stiglitz. He denigrates Professor Stiglitz. He's only got a Nobel Prize in economics. I mean, what would he know? What's your Nobel Prize in? What did you get the Nobel Prize for? What did you get the Nobel Prize for? No, I don't recall your Nobel Prize. Professor Stiglitz, what would he know? The honourable member says. The honourable member for Fadden says over there. Well, no, well, I'll take a Nobel Prize-winning economics over the old honourable member for Fadden there any day. And that's what he went on to say. He said, during the global recession, Kevin Rudd's government implemented one of the strongest Keynesian stimulus packages in the world. The honourable member for Fadden accused Joseph Stiglitz of the terrible crime of being a Keynesian. Oh, terrible. How could you be a Keynesian? Keynes, he's such an economic literate, isn't he? What would the honourable member for Fadden have to say in this debate? I can't wait to hear it.
Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover over there. But I digress, Mr Deputy Speaker, having been distracted by the inane and pathetic contributions of the member for Fadden. I'll go back to Joseph Stiglitz.
I call the honourable member for Fadden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable member opposite can stick to his notes, but he can't defame members. Otherwise, his rich record on boats and other issues may well come to the fore.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the honourable member objecting to inane or pathetic? I'll withdraw whichever one he's objecting to.
I didn't actually ask him to withdraw because I'm not that pathetic to the honourable member opposite. I simply asked him he can actually improve his argument or he can sit there and yell and waffle. I'd rather you improve your argument, sir.
I'll give the call to the honourable member for McMahon.
Against frivolous points of order and have warned honourable members for that sort of stunt. The honourable member for Fadden, who denigrates Professor Stiglitz, might want to hear what Professor Stiglitz went on to say. He said, that package was delivered early with cash grants that could be spent quickly, followed by longer-term investments that buoyed confidence and activity over time. In many other countries, stimulus was too small and arrived too late, after jobs and confidence were already lost. In Australia, the stimulus helped avoid a recession and saved up to 200,000 jobs. And the new research shows that stimulus may have actually reduced government debt over time. Evidence from the crisis that when the economy is weak, the long-run tax revenue benefits of keeping businesses afloat and people in work can be greater than the short-run expenditure on stimulus measures. That means a well-targeted stimulus might actually reduce public debt in the long run. Now, I quote that at some length, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it's an important contribution. I simply make the point, this point, that if Australia had gone into a deep and prolonged recession, as was likely, without government intervention, then that would still have seen government revenues fall, government expenditure increase, and Australia go into deficit, and Australia be dealing with the overhang still at this point. And it's not just Professor Stiglitz who the honourable member for Fadden chooses to denigrate. It's also the OECD. He might choose to denigrate them in a moment. The OECD said of Australia's response, the stimulus package was among the most effective in the OECD and is estimated to have boosted growth by some 2 percentage points in 2009. Are we going to denigrate the OECD as well? Are they Keynesian lefties as well? OECD. The OECD endorsed Australia's response during the global financial crisis. In an open letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, more than 50 of Australia's leading economics professors said this: "We, the undersigned economists, are convinced by the evidence that the coordinated policies of the Australian Labor government have prevented the economy from a deep recession and prevented a massive increase in unemployment. The performance of the Australian economy has been outstanding. The International Monetary Fund and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development have showcased Australia as a model economy. We hope that the economic achievements of the Australian Labor government will be recognised by the population." 50 economists, professors of economics. What would they know, Mr Deputy Speaker, compared to the vast economics knowledge of the member for Fadden? Or we saw Richard Goyder, Managing Director of one of Australia's largest companies, Wesfarmers, who said, and I quote, "I think they," and he's referring to the stimulus payments, Mr Deputy Speaker, "were very effective. They helped turn what was potentially a second quarter of negative growth into a small quarter of very small positive growth. I reckon the psychological impact of going into technical recession versus not going into technical recession made a big difference to the Australian psyche and economy." So this is the record, Mr Deputy Speaker, not just Professor Stiglitz, as eminent as he is, not just the OECD, as considered as they are, not just the International Monetary Fund, as respected as they are, not just 50 economics professors, as respected as they all are, but also Australian business. And I just chose to quote Richard Goyder. There were plenty of others at the time who recognised the impact of the stimulus in ensuring that their businesses remained viable comparatively in that very difficult economic times. And we've heard a lot too about the state of the budget, and no doubt we'll hear again more today. And I'm simply going to make this point, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm not going to belabour it, but I'm going to make the point that we have seen the previous Labor government stimulate the economy when necessary, something we do not apologise for, something we're proud of, but then put in place measures to ensure that spending was reduced as economic growth returned. And a 2013 IMF paper confirmed, having reviewed government spending in Australia since the 1960s, that the only profligate period of spending was not the GFC, not the stimulus payments, but was under the Howard government. It is incredible. The honourable member for Fadden is right today at least once. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, and that was your moment. That was your moment, where you say it's amazing. Yes, it is amazing. The Howard government found by the IMF to be the most profligate in Australian history. And this is what we see from the current government being too small-minded and too mean-spirited to acknowledge the plaudits for the economic management of the previous government. We saw the Howard government be the highest taxing government in Australian history and to be found by the IMF to be the most profligate. And 2012-13 saw the only contraction in nominal spending the budget seen in more than 40 years, as that spending was reduced, as it was always intended to be, as the need for stimulus receded, as was always planned by the previous Labor governments. And I saw a couple of weeks ago Treasury's Executive Director of Fiscal, Nigel Ray, told a Senate inquiry into the Commission of Audit that the government's balance sheet was in, and I quote, a relatively strong position, giving the government space to implement further stimulus if another global downturn required it. As he was answering the question about what would be done if a further global downturn, which is not predicted, but if a further global downturn did eventuate, did the government have room to respond? He made clear that the budget is in, to quote him, a relatively strong position, and that the government could respond if necessary. So we've got the coalition here engaging in yet further stunts. This very, very important bill, they say, which will save the massive sum of $250,000 over the next 4 years. That's their big contribution to budget repair. Less than the salary of a cabinet minister for 1 year. They'll save over 4. Might be better by streamlining the cabinet might be more effective. And then we have this government, this treasurer who likes to huff and puff and beat his chest and fulminate about the age of entitlement, is introducing a paid parental leave scheme which will cost $5 billion a year. Well, that $250,000 will make a small contribution to the $5 billion. We've got the $20 million bill on taxpayers for marriage counselling services, and a government which is intent, instead of implementing an economic plan, instead of actually doing something about the 54,000 jobs that have been lost on their watch, instead of actually developing a plan to counteract the decline in mining investment across the country, engaging in these stunts. Well, we're not having it, Mr Deputy Speaker. If the government expects the Labor Party to walk away from the proud economic record which saw Australia through the global financial crisis, they have another thing coming. I move the second reading amendment in my name, Mr Deputy Speaker, which reads that all following words after that be omitted with view to substituting the following words. Whilst not declining to give the bill a second reading, the House is of the opinion that the $900 payments, along with infrastructure investments, including schools, roads and social housing, prevented recession and saved hundreds of thousands of jobs and small businesses following the global financial crisis. I move that. I understand the honourable member for Blackstone will second it, because it does represent the true history of the global financial crisis, not the sort of propaganda rewriting we've heard from this government and no doubt will hear in the contributions to follow.